Andrew Eborn is a barrister, broadcaster and futurist and the president of Octopus TV, who's going to go through the papers with me this morning. Andrew, good morning.
Good morning, and delight to join you as always, Rosie.
Shall we start with the status of NHS strikes? And the Eye's got, hospital bosses saying they're desperate for the strikes to end. We know that there was a real controversy over the weekend when nurses went on strike, and there was one incident where they were recalled to come back to the hospital and the nurses refused to do so. What is the solution to this stalemate, Andrew?
Well, it is absolutely appalling, the sort of knock-on effect. I mean, as I always say, there is no magic money tree when they're looking at the offer on the table, which is 5%, and the NHS Staff Council are set to vote today on that offer. What you need to look at is the balance and the massive, devastating effect. They're saying that more than 500,000 appointments and procedures have already been hit by strikes. There's a waiting list of 7.2 million patients, and that's set to grow. And I think it's Dr. Tim Cooksley, he's the president of the Society for Acute Medicine. He says we're basically in an eternal winter, the NHS, which is offering unacceptable standards of care. So I have a lot of sympathy because obviously there's an eating versus heating a crisis. A lot of people are suffering at the moment, but there needs to be some sort of realistic thing. I think when people sign up as a nurse, there's a standard of care that you do have to provide, and it's absolutely shocking what's happening. And they're talking about reports about A&E losing out on that. There were reports about Great Ormond Street and the suffering there. I think a lot of that is obviously pulling on the heartstrings, to say the devastating effect. But it's trying to work out how do you pay for this.
The nurses will say, and I'm not a nurse, but I think the nurses from ones we've spoken to and interviewed on Times Radio will say, well, the reality is we're understaffed and it's not safe for us to work every day, not just a strike action day. We need to strike, otherwise what else will change that?
Yeah, and as I say, I have a lot of sympathy for that view. We need to look at that. Look at ways that we might be able to assist with that. And it's not just money. There are efficiencies that should be looked at within the NHS. And we're going to come on to this later about how AI and robotics may actually be able to help. I always say that what happens is where there's a necessity is the mother of invention. And what will happen is you will accelerate the various opportunities there are with technology to increase efficiency and to look at alternatives through AI and robotics, as well as the normal traditional workforce.
We're going to be looking at the sort of infrastructure behind that potential deal and what all the NHS unions might be agreeing to at lunchtime today in about 15 minutes' time on the programme. Front page of the Times is this previous pledge of the Labour Party to say, and we talked about it with Terry, that we'll give you free university tuition. It appears that, that's just not necessarily going to be affordable for the Labour Party. How much do you think this will hurt them when it comes to, the gear up to the next general election?
Well, this is yet another election, a promise that Labour made. I mean, the last two general election manifestos promised to abolish tuition fees, and his successful leadership, Starmer's successful leadership campaign in 2020 pledged to retain that policy. But I think people always say in politics that a U-turn is a bad thing. I'm not sure U-turns really are. And in defence of U-turns, I think you need to look at circumstances all of the time to adjust thinking accordingly. And he does make a clear point that at the moment, it doesn't make economic sense to be able to provide this. So we are expecting that to be abolished. And if you look at tuition fees around the world, it's what, 9,250 here in the UK. In China, I think it's about 4,700. Some countries, they have it free, including Sweden, which allows all EU and citizens to go in for free. But you then look at places like America, where if you want to go to Harvard, I think the current fee is about $57,246 before you start getting, obviously, scholarships and so on and so forth to help with that. So it is a policy. It's yet another abandoned policy from Labour. It will hit them unless they sort of introduce the narrative early, because then people get used to it and they try and put it into perspective.
Royals, we're not going to be able to get away from it. If you're not a fan, then I'm afraid this isn't going to be the week for you wherever you look. The Daily Mail have said, look, Britain's rock solid support for royals. And Andrew, there's this survey that's been done, and you could be one of these. Okay, a committed royalist, a mainstream monarchist, a neutral pragmatist, a modern Republican, or an angry abolitionist. Which are you?
Well, I always like alliteration, but I have to say I'm probably near the middle. I think that the royal family is one of our biggest assets around the world, and it is glorious. They're predicting a global audience of 300 million. And you remember the last coronation 70 years ago, it basically ushered in the age of television. It was the first time that people watched television more than they listened on the radio. They had an audience of about 20 million last time. They're anticipating it could be up to 300 million around the world this time. They are one of our greatest assets. But also being realistic, which probably puts me somewhere in the middle of the glorious survey categories which they've done. It does need modernising, and Charles is doing that. He's looking at a scaled-down monarchy. He's looking at a scaled-down coronation. And obviously some royals are more popular than others. So the ones who are absolute royalists, I think, is the top of the charts. You'd have to approve of absolutely everybody. Although, interestingly, they do say, I think the Mails say, everybody apart from Harry and Meghan, which I thought was a bit mean. But I'm somewhere near the middle. I think the royal family does some tremendous work. It does need modernising, and indeed it's being modernised. And one of the lovely things I saw from this week was your attempts at doing the coronation quiche, which I thought was glorious. How did that turn out?
No, it was a genuine disaster because I used a loose bottom tin. So all of the liquid fell through it.
There's nothing worse than a loose bottom, as they say on Bake Off.
No, it was truly terrible. That top tip, if you're going to make it, don't do what I did. What's interesting, Andrew, the Times have picked this out on the front page, is that the specific research saying doubts over whether the king will be good for the monarchy seem to have faded as his popularity has risen. Do you think he'll be a good king?
Well, I have to say, to his defence, I thought he surprised me. He's a lot better than I thought he was. And the Times is talking about his approval rating is now 62% before the coronation. And if you looked at that, last year, I think it was about 39%. So the new polling is showing very positive ratings. He's going around the world. He did tremendously well in Germany and surprised everybody by speaking German. I'm not quite sure why it was a surprise in light of his ancestors. But anyway, he did surprise them. I think he's doing very, very well. And I also think Camilla, who's a patron of one of the charities that I'm involved with, is a superb ambassador. I mean, the public's perception of her has changed dramatically over the last few years. And I think that's a very, very good thing. But we need something that does unify us. And the great thing about what's going to happen on May the 6th, apart from Archie's birthday, is that it will unify the country to a great extent. And I think people getting together and having a feel-good factor has got to be a good thing.
Yeah, if you're listening, I'd love to know what you think this morning. You know, is he going to be a good king? Are you excited as this moment in history? If you remember the last coronation, I'd particularly love to hear from you. Well, you can text the programme 87222. Start your message with the word Times. On the front page of the Telegraph, Andrew, if we move on briefly, this Godfather of AI, that's how he's been dubbed. He was the head of Google Brain, their research arm. He's quit very publicly, and he's done so because he's saying this technology that we're creating is dangerous.
Well, and I have to say that he's not alone in this. For many years, I've been predicting about the seismic changes that AI and robotics and so on and so forth will bring to everything, to every aspect of our life, from creativity to our workforce and so on and so forth. In fact, it was Stephen Hawking who said it was our greatest achievement, AI, but also the biggest existential threat. And Geoffrey Hinton, that's the name, the godfather of AI, he developed the foundations of modern machine learning. He says that the speed of change is scary. He's been shocked at how quickly it would happen. He would thought maybe 30, 40, maybe even 50 years longer before it would basically be smarter than people. But we've had a couple of instances this week alone where you had the master of the rolls, Sir Geoffrey Voss, has come out and basically says it's smarter than lawyers and should be used in certain cases to make it more efficient in terms of judgment. You've also had ChatGPT being declared to be more relevant and more empathetic than a normal GP because they've got more time and they can access more research. Now, I always say it's an incredibly powerful tool, and rather than putting our heads in the sand, we have to understand the capabilities. And as you know, I sort of talk around the world. I was in Cannes at the TV and Film Festival last time we spoke, And I was talking there about the advances in technology and how AI is revolutionizing the content creation and distribution and consumption industries. And it's being aware of that sort of side. In music, you have all these things where Universal Music and so on and so forth are worried about the advances in AI because of what happens in terms of creativity.
But I guess some of the specific concerns of Geoffrey Hinton here, he said, it's hard to see how you can prevent the bad actors from using it for bad things. That it could be smarter than us. He said, this could be taking over our jobs. Disinformation can be spread by chatbots. And we know that Google's chief executive recently admitted that the pace of development kept him awake at night, saying it could be very harmful if deployed wrongly. Do you think we've actually got the right sort of checks, the right legislation to make sure we are using it properly?
No, I think basically technology has advanced far quicker than the legislation, and the legislation desperately needs to catch up. We also need to deal with these things called hallucinations, where chatbots and this is talking about the disinformation that is spread. And often what will happen, the chatbot will come up with an answer just to fill a void. So it wrongly accused Jonathan Turley, for example, a US law professor. He was wrongly accused of sexual harassment. They just made it up. Brian Hood, an Australian mayor, he was falsely accused of being imprisoned for bribery. So what happens, you need to have the safeguards in place. And already people are looking at, from a legal point of view, they've started to introduce it so that basically what happens if it doesn't know the answer, they've put those stops in place. But you need these experts to come out. And the reason he quit his job is he saw it as a sort of conflict, if you like, if he continued at Google, because he wouldn't be able to warn people about the dangers. But it's absolutely right. The law needs to understand. We need to understand what the capabilities are. The law needs to keep pace of it to make sure that appropriate protections are in place and the commercial landscape is set up that people are properly rewarded, if you like, for their intellectual property. But have those safeguards in place.
But also, look what happens when we carry around a device that connects us to the internet the entire time. In the Times, pupils, we're coming up to exam season, aren't we? Pupils risk exam punishment rather than giving up their phones. So one of the exam regulatory bodies has had to issue advice to schools saying, pupils might be bringing their phones into the exam hall. They're not necessarily doing it because they want to cheat. Instead, I'm quoting here, mobiles have become such a fundamental part of modern life that students do not wish to be without them, even for a few hours.
No, it's quite shocking. Their mobile phones really are a comfort blanket for people, and being separated can cause extreme anxiety. And so what they're looking at, you're right, even though they might get these penalties with no intention at all of cheating, but merely just don't want to be separated from their phone, they're looking at sort of introducing coin-operated lockers outside exam rooms and bag and tag systems to make it a bit safer. But even Ofqual is sort of saying students know that breaking this important rule could lose them marks or even disqualify them, but they still do it because they have this incredible attachment. And it's a psychological, it's rather like fear of missing out or fear of going out or fear of any of that sort of side. People hate to be separated from their mobile phones.
It sounds like the problem, Andrew, shouldn't be being worried about cheating. It's worried about students being addicted to their mobiles and the anxiety they'd have by being separated from them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's that need to have a digital detox that you need to look at.
Dare I ask you, what's your hourly screen time like?
Far too much. Although I like to listen. Listen to the radio, Times Radio all the time. So that'll be good. Part of my job is working on screen, so I think on that sort of stuff. But I also like to walk and to put it away and to go to the theatre and various other things as well. So I like to try and balance it. But my job is involving screens. So I do think all of us need to sort of look at the possibility of digitally detoxing. Because people, every time a ping goes off on your phone or you're kept hooked because you see ... because somebody might be typing something to you. All of these things are built to make us hooked onto our devices. But I do think that as a result, that I always say that the more means of communication that we have from a technology point of view, the less we're able to communicate. And seeing people in restaurants now pulling out their phones and not really talking to each other or engaging, it means they're all cocooned in their own digital world.
It's potentially miserable. Andrew, we have to leave it there for time, but thank you very much. Andrew Eborn, barrister, broadcaster, futurist and president of Octopus TV, going through the papers with me. I have to say I dread that Monday notification about how many hours a day you spent on your phone last week. So I'm on a mission to bring it down.